Hello, and welcome back to Who Knew? Everybody loves a good underdog story. Rocky, Miracle, Moneyball, Invincible, and a whole bunch of other sports movies I couldn't give a rat's ass about. You also have Slumdog Millionaire, Forrest Gump, and The Pursuit of Happiness. Our video today takes a look at one of the greatest and most celebrated underdog stories in British military history, largely due to it being a victory over a whole load of snooty French knights by a band of starved, disease-ridden, and quite possibly criminal peasants. We're of course talking about the Battle of Agincourt. That's right, I did say Agincourt and not Agincourt. Agincourt is actually just outside the town of Nancy, nearly 300 miles southeast of Agincourt, which itself is about 45 miles south of Calais. At the time, Calais was a British-held port and where our bedraggled band of bandits were headed. Back to the naming, or rather misnaming, of the battle. This is largely due to us Brits. Not content with having just butchered most of the French nobility, Henry V decided to rub salt in the wound by butchering the nearby town's name as well. Apparently Henry, believing his army was likely doomed, didn't even ask where he was fighting until after the battle. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves though. The Battle of Agincourt, and in honour of my historic ancestors I will continue to call it by their name, was one of the most famous battles during the 100 Years' War. This war, which took place between 1337 and 1453, I'll let you do the math, was less of a continuous fight and more of a handful of conflicts that sprung up any time the kings of each country could find enough cash and men. Mostly though, it was a period of medieval European history where being a peasant in northern France was likely going to result in a bad time. The chance of being raided by English bandits looking to plunder anything that wasn't nailed down was pretty damn high. We've not got time to cover this entire period though, so our story starts with King Henry. No, not that one, or that one, or that one, or even that one. Yeah, that one. King Henry V. Look at that bowl cut. Believe it or not, this wasn't actually a fashion statement. Henry was only 26 when he became king, but had spent a large part of his youth fighting. This hairdo was common amongst helmet-wearing knights, and this is the reason why Henry opted for this unusual look. If the ladies didn't dig his hair though, perhaps they'd dig his battle scars. While doing what nobility did best back then, suppressing the common folk of Wales, an arrow actually struck Henry's face. This left him with a scar, and is also the reason why many of his famous portraits are in profile. In many ways, by the time he succeeded to the throne, he'd already made a name for himself as a bit of a badass. It wasn't all fighting and glory though. King Henry happened to be especially pious, and he used his God-given right to rule to suppress anyone he considered a heretic. So where does France come into all of this? Well, prior to Henry becoming king, Richard II had made peace with France in the late 1390s. However, the peace was about as solid as you would expect from two historic rivals back then. Due to the convoluted nature of heirs and successors during medieval Europe, Henry V had no intention of keeping the peace. In his mind, he was the rightful ruler of France and was just biding his time. He wouldn't have to wait long though. France had been suffering through an internal crisis. King Charles VI of France had a bit of a reputation for being, well, a bit mad. He allegedly ran around his palace howling like a wolf, as well as believing he was made of glass. Seriously. Because of this, the French had the not so terrible idea of swapping him out for a less insane ruler. This split the country between two groups, the Burgundians, led by Charles VI's cousin, and the Armagnacs under Louis, Charles's brother, and the Mad King Charles VI himself. In 1414, both factions came to Henry for assistance. Instead of continuing the English tradition of agreeing with both sides behind the other's back for a hefty fee, Henry said sure, on the condition that I can marry one of your princesses, and while I'm at it, I'll have the French throne too. Naturally, even a divided France wasn't going to hand over the throne to a Turnipsean Brit. Henry knew this though, and so upon the refusal declared that it left him no choice but to prepare for war. Unbeknownst to the French, this had been the plan all along, and Henry had spent the past year planning his invasion and building up an army. That invasion came in August 1415 when Henry set sail with an armada of 1,500 ships, chocked full with supplies, cannons, horse, and most importantly of all, 12,000 soldiers spoiling for a fight. Just like his allied descendants, Henry chose not to land in Calais, but instead decided on Normandy, reversing 1066. It was only after his army disembarked that Henry broke the bad news to the men. This excursion across the Channel wasn't going to be like the previous ones. This time, there was going to be no raping and pillaging of the local countryside. No doubt this came as a huge disappointment for many of his soldiers, who were probably only there to do a little bit of raping and pillaging. Still, they set about besieging the port town of Harfleur. Unfortunately, this French town had learned a thing or two in the years prior and built some quite formidable fortifications to keep the Brits out. Henry's siege dragged on longer than expected. Many of his men weren't even lost to cannon fire or crossbow bolts, but instead died to camp fever, dysentery to us. One contemporary historian referred to this as a bloody flux. Come September 22nd, when the town finally surrendered, Henry had lost a third of his army. This was made worse by many of his men needing to be sent home sick. Another few hundred would also be required to stay at Harfleur to hold things down. Like it or not, Henry had to abandon his plan to march on Paris. There was another problem too. Winter was coming. Contrary to what a popular TV show might have taught you, medieval armies didn't generally fight in the winter. A bit miffed that his plans were ruined, and not content with going home after only capturing one poxy town, Henry decided to put on a show of force by marching what remained of his army across the French countryside to British-held Calais. This brings us pretty much back to where we started. In hindsight, this clearly wasn't a smart decision, marching a diminished and disease-ridden army through enemy territory just to prove a point, but who was really going to argue with a king whose blood was up? Their journey was far from a pleasant stroll through the French countryside either. Being October at this point, and northern France, they faced torrential rain which slowed their progress considerably. Not only that, but every time they reached a river crossing, it had either been destroyed or was guarded, meaning they had to fight small skirmishes all the way. By the time the English had crossed the River Somme, the French had managed to muster a large force ahead of them, and on October 24th, the two opposing armies came face to face outside the town of Agincourt. I think this would be a good moment to throw out some numbers. At this point in Henry's campaign, his army had shrunk to somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 men, most of whom were lightly armoured archers, with only about 1/6 being dismounted men-at-arms. The French, on the other hand, had managed to build up a force of approximately 15,000 men, largely made up of heavily armoured troops with an additional 10,000 armed servants to boot. Much of the French aristocracy had turned out for the occasion, looking for some honour and glory, or likely just hoping to bash a few English peasants' skulls in. Not only that, but the French knew that if they hung on long enough, additional reinforcements would arrive. Not very sporting of them. Accounts do vary as to the size of each army, with Shakespeare putting the French at 60,000 in his play Henry V, but this is almost certainly an overestimation. Still, even with the roughly 25,000 already mentioned, the French army dwarfed the worn-down English. The French sent messengers to Henry to inform the king that they intended to fight and take revenge for Harfleur. This threat was probably a bit redundant considering the size of the French force. You're not going to gather that many soldiers without intending to fight, but like all hammy villains, they probably just couldn't help but monologue a bit. Instead of trying to talk his way out of the situation, or even, God forbid, beg for mercy, Henry simply replied, "Be all things according to the will of God." In other words, is about to go down. That night, the English camped in a wet, muddy field, quite possibly making peace with the fact that the next day was going to be a massacre. They weren't wrong. Their mood probably wasn't helped either by the sounds and smells of partying French nobles not too far away, cooking up a storm and getting drunk, celebrating what appeared to be a done deal. So the question is this: how could the French royally screw things up? The next morning, Henry had mass said 3 times, just in case, before attempting to rouse his men a little. According to a chronicler of the time, this is the point where Henry encouraged his archers to fight to the death, as the French had threatened to cut off the fingers of any archers they happened to capture. Even if this is true, the archers likely wouldn't have taken the threat seriously. They all knew that being lowly commoners, they'd just get killed outright rather than be taken prisoner. Still, they probably would have gotten a good laugh out of it, and no doubt given the French a few hand gestures as a result. Henry was likely hoping that this, along with the overwhelming odds, would goad the French into attacking. His army was set up with men-at-arms at the centre, with 2 wings of archers on either side, all the while being protected on the flanks by thick trees and woodland. You see, Henry's plan was to rain down arrows upon the slow-moving, heavily armoured French soldiers as they attacked across a muddy field. The French, on the other hand, had a slightly different plan. This was to not be slaughtered by arrows while attacking across a muddy field. They'd learnt that this tactic was a bad idea at the Battle of Crécy, where British longbowmen punished the French, wiping out huge numbers in wave after wave of attacks. Clearly, the two sides were at a stalemate, with the odds still heavily favouring the French. Henry wasn't having any of this though. He ordered his archers to advance. This they did, in full view of the French, hauling their bows, arrows and heavy wooden stakes to within 250 metres of the French lines. This would have been a perfect time for the French to swoop in and get some easy pickings. However, they just sat back and watched, even while the archers stopped from time to time to catch their breath. Perhaps they were a little nervous of the archers after the massacre at Crécy. In any case, apparently many of the nobles, overconfident of victory later in the day, had gone off for a leisurely ride. The archers, now in position behind their protective stakes, began raining their arrows down on the front ranks of cavalry. Although I want to avoid the phrase, blot out the sun,
our arrows will blot out the sun.
It's important to take note here of exactly how this must have felt for the French. At Crécy, there were around 7,000 English longbowmen, each capable of firing 10 arrows a minute. So, within the first 60 seconds of the battle, up to 70,000 arrows would have fallen on the French.
Then we will fight in the shade.
I very much doubt any of them would have appreciated fighting in the shade at that point. Although the number of archers at Agincourt was significantly less, every one of them would have been extremely strong and well trained. A good longbowman could fire a third arrow before the first even hit the ground, or more likely, the target. And these arrows weren't those flimsy ones you likely shot in the Scouts either. A shaft a yard long and as thick as your finger, topped with a hefty bodkin arrowhead, these things would have skewered a pig, not to mention puncture that fancy armour and wreak havoc amongst the horses. So that being the case, when the arrows started to fall on the cavalry at Agincourt, they had only two options: get an arrow through the top of their helmet, or charge. This is exactly what Henry wanted. The cavalry rode forward and were either felled by arrows or impaled on wooden stakes. Injured horses threw their riders, who lay helplessly stuck in the mud. In a cruel twist of fate, their heavy armour now screwed them as they were unable to get up. Normally, this would have been the point where the archers would run forward with daggers and hatchets to finish off the wounded, or, if they were lucky enough to look rich, drag them off for ransom. However, due to the French men-at-arms advancing, the archers made a smart decision of staying behind their defensive stakes. As we've previously mentioned, this battle was happening during a rather wet October on what was effectively a muddy field, now thoroughly torn up by hundreds of horses charging about. To the French men-at-arms, it probably felt as though they were wading through a waist-deep swamp. In order to better protect themselves from the hailstorm ahead, the soldiers marched in a tight formation, almost blind due to them having to keep their visors down the entire way. Seeing the sides vulnerable, the archers on the wings simply moved forward and started firing into the packed group of men. By the time the French men-at-arms reached the English, they were likely exhausted, weighed down by their armour and caked in mud. To give them some credit, they didn't do the decent French thing and turn tail. In fact, they even managed to inflict a few casualties. Unfortunately, for the men that went first, the French kept piling in men behind them to the point where the soldiers at the front were so packed in they couldn't even raise their weapons. At this point, the archers simply put down their bows and joined the hand-to-hand with daggers and hatchets. Now you might think that it's a little careless for a bunch of lightly armoured men to jump into a brawl with a large group of heavily armoured soldiers, but that's where you're wrong. The French now found themselves swarmed by agile adversaries, able to simply dodge their clumsy swings. Many of the French were swiftly dealt with via a quick stab to the armpit, or, if they were wearing fancy enough armour, simply pushed over and dragged off as a hostage. Normally this would have been the best situation for you. Once your family had taxed the local peasants into oblivion and coughed up the ransom, you'd be let loose again. However, on this occasion, there was a grim surprise in store for the captured men. French estimates put the number of hostages taken by the British at around 1,500. This could possibly be due to the large number of Poncy nobles out to make a name for themselves. Once captured, the prisoners were under oath not to rejoin the fight, and after the they'd just been through, most of them were probably happy to keep that oath. Unfortunately for them though, a nearby lord had heard the ruckus going on down the street and managed to put together a few hundred locals, who promptly set about attacking and looting the undefended English baggage train. Fearing a prisoner revolt and an attack from the rear, Henry made the decision to kill the hostages. This was very much a knightly no-no, especially by a supposedly chivalrous king, but the battle hadn't been won yet, and with the number of French in the area, they were enough of a danger that the fear was justified. The order didn't go down too well with many of the English, who were a little put out at having to kill what in their minds was human booty, and so Henry had to send a group of his most bloodthirsty archers to do the deed. Soon enough, the French fighting elite were being stabbed and beaten to death. Naturally, if you were to bring this battle up with a Frenchman nowadays, they'd be quick to point out this ruthless breaking of the rules of war. But it wouldn't be a small thing to point out how a few hundred years later, when things were meant to be a little bit more civilized, the French slaughtered far more of their own population in public for mostly trumped up charges. Still, The surviving French were apparently so sickened, or quite possibly so scared of meeting the same fate as their comrades, that they packed up and left, some of them doing a little pillaging of their own on their way home. A commoner is a commoner after all. In the end, the French casualties were as high as 10,000, which included much of the nobility. This compares to the English 300. It was several days after the Brits had moved on before the locals decided to bury the dead in a mass grave. Henry returned home an even bigger badass than before, having turned certain defeat into such a pushover for the English. The French respite was short-lived though, as in 1417 Henry returned with another army and spent a year taking city after city throughout northern France. Eventually in 1418 he managed to capture Rouen, the capital of Normandy. And again, here enters the Armagnacs and their opponents the Burgundians. Long story short, the king's son and future Charles VII had the Duke hacked to death while they met under a flag of truce. Naturally, John's son wasn't super thrilled that his dad had been murdered, particularly in such a brutal way, so he made a deal with Henry V, which effectively gave the king control over almost all of northern France, including Paris. By 1420, the mad King Charles VI was forced to throw in the towel. Henry got married to Charles's daughter Catherine, and the following year she gave birth to their son and the future Henry VI. Henry V's luck finally ran out in 1422, when aged only 35 he died suddenly, possibly of dysentery but more likely of a severe case of heat stroke. No matter how he went, the 9 years he ruled definitely left its mark on Europe. Had he survived a little longer, he'd likely have been crowned King of France. Who knows what kind of an impact that may have had down the line. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, something a little less sciencey than the previous one. If there are any other battles or wars you think would be cool to cover, let us know those down below in the comments. Otherwise, until next time, thanks for watching. However, this piece was about as solid as